The ink-stained fingers of Florence Sutherland had written more love letters than she had ever received. And at 23 years old, that truth had begun to settle like dust in her heart. She sat at her small wooden desk in the corner of Stillwater's General Store, Wyoming Territory, 1876, watching the afternoon sun paint golden streaks across the worn floorboards while her pen scratched across paper. The letter she was writing belonged to Mrs. Henderson, words meant for her sister back in Philadelphia, but Florence gave them the warmth and care she gave all her work. The bell above the door chimed, and Florence glanced up from her writing. The man who entered had to duck beneath the doorframe, his shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the entire entrance. He wore buckskin and fur, his dark hair hanging past his shoulders in waves that caught the sunlight. His beard was thick, but trimmed close enough to reveal a strong jawline, and his arms looked like they could snap timber with bare hands. Mountain men came through Stillwater occasionally, but this one made her breath catch in her throat. He stood there for a moment, his gray eyes scanning the store until they landed on her desk. The sign above her station read "Letters Written Fair Prices" in her own careful script. He moved toward her with surprising grace for someone so large, his boots heavy against the floor. "You the scribe?" His voice was deep, roughened by wind and weather. Florence set down her pen and straightened her shoulders. "I am. Florence Sutherland. How may I help you?" He pulled off his hat, revealing more of that thick, dark hair. Up close, she could see the small scars on his hands, the weathered quality of his skin that spoke of years spent under an unforgiving sky. "Name is Benjamin Thorne. I need someone who can write." "That's what I do, Mr. Thorne." She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Please sit." "What kind of letter do you need?" Benjamin lowered himself into the chair, which looked almost comically small beneath him. He set his hat on his knee and studied her for a long moment. Florence felt heat rise in her cheeks under his gaze, but she held his eyes steadily. "Not exactly a letter," he said slowly, "more like a story." Florence picked up a fresh sheet of paper. "I can do that. Is this for someone specific? A family history, perhaps? A love story?" The words seemed to surprise him as much as they surprised her. "I want you to write a love story. One that hasn't happened yet." She set down the paper. "I'm not sure I understand." Benjamin leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I've spent the last 10 years in these mountains, trapping, hunting, living alone. I'm 31 years old, and I've never had much use for fancy words or knowing how to say things proper. But I've been watching you through that window for the past 3 days, and I've seen how you write for other people. You give them words they don't have themselves." Florence's heart began to beat faster. "You've been watching me." "Not in any improper way," he said quickly. "I came down from the high country to sell my furs and stock up on supplies. I was supposed to head back up yesterday, but I couldn't seem to make myself leave. Kept finding reasons to stay in town. Then I realized why." He met her eyes directly. "I'd like to court you, Miss Sutherland, but I'm not the kind of man who knows how to say pretty things. So I thought maybe you could write our story as we go. Teach me the words I need to win your heart." The request was so unexpected, so bold and honest that Florence found herself speechless. She had spent years writing other people's romances, their confessions and proposals, their declarations of love. No one had ever asked her to write her own. "Mr. Thorne," she began, but he held up a hand. "Call me Ben, please." "Ben," she said, testing the name on her tongue. "You don't even know me. What makes you think we would suit?" "I know you're kind," he said. "I've watched you help Mrs. Henderson with her packages even though writing letters is your job, not hauling goods. I know you're patient because I saw you work with young Tommy Miller for over an hour, teaching him his letters even though he wasn't paying for lessons. I know you're strong because you've made a place for yourself in this town, and that takes grit." He paused. "And I know that when you smile at something someone's written, your whole face lights up like sunrise over the mountains." Florence felt tears prick at her eyes. In all her years of writing beautiful words for others, no one had ever spoken to her with such simple, devastating honesty. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "Say you'll let me try," Ben said. "Let me court you proper, and while I do, you can write down our story. Maybe at the end I'll have learned enough words from you to tell you myself how I feel. Or maybe we'll discover we don't suit at all, and you'll have a nice story to tell someday." Florence looked at this mountain man, this stranger who had somehow seen her in ways no one else ever had, and made a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. "All right, Ben Thorne. You have yourself an agreement." The smile that broke across his face transformed him. The hard edges softened, and she saw genuine joy there, unguarded and warm. "When can I see you? I mean proper like, for courting." "I finish here at 6, Florence said. "There's a respectable dining room at the hotel. We could take supper there." "I'll be here at 6, Ben promised. He stood, retrieving his hat. "And Miss Sutherland, Florence, thank you." After he left, Florence sat at her desk, unable to focus on Mrs. Henderson's letter. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she pressed them flat against the wood to steady herself. 23 years old, and this was the first time a man had courted her. There had been interested parties before, but they always seemed to want her skill with words more than they wanted her. They wanted someone to write their business correspondence or teach their children. Ben wanted something different. He wanted her to write their love story. That evening, Florence changed into her best dress, a deep blue cotton that brought out her eyes. She pinned her auburn hair carefully, allowing a few curls to frame her face. Her hands shook as she fastened the small cameo brooch at her throat, the only piece of jewelry her mother had left her before passing 5 years prior. Ben was waiting outside the general store at precisely 6 o'clock. He had cleaned up, though he still wore buckskin. His hair was damp, slicked back from his face, and he smelled of soap and something else, something like pine and fresh air. "You look beautiful," he said simply. Florence felt that same directness in his words, that lack of artifice. "Thank you. You clean up rather well yourself." He offered his arm, and she took it, feeling the solid muscle beneath the buckskin. They walked the short distance to the hotel, drawing a few curious glances from townspeople. Florence knew there would be talk. A respectable scribe and a mountain man made an unusual pairing. The dining room was modest but clean, with red checked tablecloths and oil lamps that cast a warm glow. Ben pulled out her chair before taking his own seat, and Florence found herself charmed by the gesture. He might claim not to know proper manners, but someone had taught him the basics. "Tell me about yourself," Florence said once they had ordered. "Where are you from originally?" Ben leaned back in his chair, looking slightly uncomfortable with the attention. "Pennsylvania. Small farm outside Pittsburgh. I was the youngest of 6 boys. When my parents died, the farm went to my oldest brother, as was proper. I was 19 and didn't see much point in staying to work someone else's land, so I headed west. Spent a year in St. Louis learning the fur trade, then pushed into the mountains. Been there ever since. You see your brothers, not for years. We were never close. They're good men, I suppose, but they didn't understand why I wanted to leave. Thought I was running from responsibility." He paused. "Maybe I was at first, but I found something up there in those mountains. Peace, purpose. A way of living that made sense to me." Their food arrived, beef stew with fresh bread. Florence waited for Ben to continue. "What about you?" he asked. "You're not originally from Stillwater, are you?" "Your accent is Eastern." "Boston," Florence confirmed. "My father was a teacher, my mother a seamstress. They taught me to read and write before I could barely walk. When they passed, both within a year of each other, I had nothing keeping me there. I'd read so many stories about the West, about the adventures and the freedom. So I used what little money they left me to come out here. That was 3 years ago. And you started writing letters for people, Florence nodded. I discovered quickly that many people out here either can't write or don't write well, but they have things they need to say. Letters to family back east, business correspondence, even just personal documents they want recorded properly. I found I could make a living from it. Mr. Patterson, who owns the general store, lets me rent the corner space. He says I bring in customers who then buy his goods. You like it, the work? No one had ever asked her that before. Florence considered the question carefully. I do, mostly. There's satisfaction in helping people express themselves, but sometimes. She trailed off, unsure how much to reveal, sometimes what. Ben's gray eyes were intent on her face. Sometimes it's lonely, she admitted. Writing everyone else's love letters, everyone else's important moments. Being part of their lives but not really part of them. Always on the outside, looking in. Ben reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. His hand was huge, calloused, and warm, completely engulfing hers. Not anymore, he said quietly. The simple statement carried such weight that Florence felt tears threaten again. She turned her hand over, squeezing his fingers in return. They talked through dinner, the conversation flowing more easily than Florence had expected. Ben told her about life in the mountains, about the streams so clear you could see every pebble on the bottom, about the silence that was somehow louder than any city noise. He talked about the animals he trapped, the cabin he had built with his own hands, the long winters when he wouldn't see another human soul for months. Florence told him about the letters she had written, the stories she had helped people tell. She talked about the young wife writing to her mother about her first pregnancy, the old man recording his memories of fighting in the Mexican War, the teenage girl who needed help writing a letter declining a proposal from a man twice her age. You give people their voices, Ben said. That's a gift. When they finished dinner, Ben walked her back to the boarding house where she rented a room. The night was cool, stars brilliant overhead in the vast Wyoming sky. At her door, Ben stopped and turned to face her. I'd like to see you again tomorrow, he said, if you're willing. I am, Florence said, very willing. There's something I want to show you, a place just outside town. Would you take a ride with me? I'll have you back by evening, and I promise you'll be completely safe. Florence knew she should probably decline. Going off alone with a man she had just met was improper, but something in his eyes, in the careful way he asked, made her trust him. All right. What time? I'll collect you at 9, right here. He tipped his hat and turned to go, but Florence called after him. Ben, he stopped, looking back. Thank you for a lovely evening. That smile again, transforming his rugged face. The pleasure was mine, Florence, entirely mine. That night, Florence lay in her narrow bed and thought about the impossible turn her life had taken. This morning, she had been the lonely scribe, writing other people's happiness. Tonight, she was a woman being courted by a mountain man who wanted her to write their love story. It felt like something from one of the novels she had read as a girl, too good to be real. But when Ben arrived the next morning with 2 horses, one of them, a gentle mare he said was borrowed from a friend, Florence knew it was very real indeed. He helped her mount, his hands strong and sure on her waist, and they rode out of Stillwater into the rolling countryside beyond. The morning was clear and beautiful, the air fresh with the scent of sage and grass. Ben led them east, toward a line of bluffs that rose in the distance. He rode with the ease of someone who had spent half his life in the saddle, occasionally pointing out landmarks or wildlife. A hawk circled overhead. Antelope bounded across the plains in the distance. After an hour of riding, they reached the bluffs. Ben dismounted and helped Florence down, then led the horses to a small stream where they could drink. He took Florence's hand and guided her up a narrow path between the rocks. At the top, Florence gasped. They stood on a natural overlook that provided a view for miles in every direction. The plains stretched out below them, golden in the morning light, with the mountains rising purple and majestic to the west. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of wildflowers. "I found this place my first year out here," Ben said, standing beside her. "When things got hard, when I questioned whether I had made the right choice leaving everything behind, I would come here. Something about this view reminded me why I kept going." Florence could understand why. The vastness of it, the raw beauty, spoke to something deep in her soul. "It's magnificent." "I wanted you to see it," Ben said. "Wanted you to understand what it is I'm offering if you'll have me. It's not an easy life up in those mountains. It's hard work and long silences and months of cold. But it's also this. This freedom, this beauty, this sense of being part of something bigger than yourself." Florence turned to look at him. The wind caught his long hair, whipping it around his face. His gray eyes were serious, searching hers. "Ben, we barely know each other," she said softly. "Yesterday was the first time we spoke." "I know," he said. "And I'm not asking you to marry me today, but I'm asking you to consider it, to spend time with me, to let me court you proper, and to think about whether you could see yourself sharing that life. What if I can't leave Stillwater? I have a business here, people who depend on me." Ben nodded slowly. "I've thought about that. I could come down more often. Could even spend winters here in town if that's what it took. I won't pretend I wouldn't miss the mountains, but I'd miss you more if I let you go without trying." The vulnerability in his voice, the raw honesty, moved Florence deeply. This man who had lived alone for a decade was offering to change his entire way of life for a woman he had just met. It should have frightened her. Instead, it filled her with a strange certainty. "I'll need time," she said. "Time to know you, to understand who you really are. But yes, Ben Thorne, I'll consider it." He took both her hands in his, raising them to his lips and kissing her knuckles gently. "That's all I ask." They sat on the overlook for another hour, talking and watching the hawks circle. Ben told her about his cabin, describing it in such detail that Florence could picture it clearly. One large room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping loft, windows facing east to catch the morning sun. He talked about his favorite fishing spots, about the family of foxes that denned near his property every spring, about the old trapper named Samuel who lived 5 miles north and was his closest neighbor. Florence told him about her dreams, things she had never spoken aloud to anyone. How she wanted to write a book someday, a real book that people would read. How she sometimes felt like she was wasting her gift writing simple letters when there were larger stories inside her waiting to come out. How she feared ending up old and alone, her life measured only in other people's words. "Write our story," Ben said. "Maybe that's where you start." "Our story isn't finished yet," Florence pointed out. "I don't know how it ends." "Then we'll write it together," Ben said, "day by day. And you can put down the words as we go." It was such a romantic notion, so perfectly suited to a woman who lived through words, that Florence felt herself falling just a little bit in love right there on that overlook. Over the next 3 weeks, Ben courted Florence with a dedication that surprised the entire town. He appeared at her desk every morning at 8, bringing her coffee from the hotel and a fresh wildflower. He would sit while she worked, reading from the collection of books she loaned him, occasionally asking about a word or phrase. She discovered he could read reasonably well but lacked formal education. He was hungry to learn, absorbing everything she taught him like parched earth drinking rain. They took meals together daily, alternating between the hotel dining room and picnics outside of town. Ben showed her how to fish in the creek, how to identify animal tracks, how to read the weather in the clouds. Florence taught him about literature and poetry, about history and geography. She read to him from her favorite novels, and he listened with an intensity that made her feel like she was sharing treasures. Every evening, Florence would return to her room and write. She had started a journal documenting their courtship, trying to capture the progression of her feelings. The words came easily, flowing from her pen like water. She wrote about the way Ben looked at her, like she was something precious and rare. She wrote about his laugh, surprisingly deep and rich. She wrote about the gentleness in his huge hands when he helped her over rough terrain, the patience in his voice when he explained something about wilderness survival. She wrote about falling in love, because that's what was happening, undeniably. With each passing day, Florence found herself more drawn to this mountain man who had walked into her life and asked her to write their love story. He was unlike anyone she had ever met. There was no pretense in him, no social games or hidden agendas. What you saw was what you received. A strong, capable, deeply honest man who had decided he wanted her and was willing to do whatever it took to win her heart. One evening, about a month after they had met, Ben asked her to read to him what she had written. They were sitting by the creek, the same spot where he had taught her to fish. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Florence hesitated, clutching her journal. "It's personal," she said. "It's about us, about you." "I know," Ben said. "That's why I want to hear it. I want to know what you see when you look at me, what you feel." She opened the journal with trembling hands and began to read. She read about that first day, how imposing he had seemed. She read about their dinner, about the overlook, about the slow progression of days spent learning each other. She read about the morning he had brought her a book of poetry he had purchased from a traveling merchant, how he had spent nearly all his fur money on it because she had mentioned wanting to read it. She read about the afternoon he had fixed Mrs. Henderson's broken wagon wheel without being asked, how he had waved away her thanks like it was nothing. And she read about love, about how it had crept up on her slowly, then all at once, about how she could no longer imagine her days without him in them. When she finished, her voice had gone hoarse. She looked up to find Ben watching her with an expression so tender it made her breath catch. "I love you too," he said simply. "I think I loved you from the moment I saw you through that window, bent over your desk, biting your lip while you concentrated on finding the perfect word. I just didn't have the words to say it until now." Florence set down her journal carefully. "Ben, marry me," he interrupted. "I know it's fast. I know we're still learning each other, but I'm 31 years old and I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Marry me, Florence. Let me spend the rest of my days giving you reasons to write happy things." Tears spilled down Florence's cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Ben Thorne, I'll marry you." He pulled her into his arms and she felt the full strength of him, the solid reality of this man who had chosen her. When he kissed her, it was gentle despite his size, reverent and sweet. Florence wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back, pouring all her love and hope into it. They decided to marry quickly. There seemed no point in waiting when they were both certain. Ben spent several days building them a small house on the outskirts of Stillwater, close enough to town that Florence could continue her work, but far enough to provide privacy. It was simple but sturdy, with 2 rooms and real glass windows that Ben had purchased from the general store at considerable expense. Florence continued writing letters, but now she did it from her own home, with a new sign by the road directing customers to her door. She also began working on something new. a book about the West, about the people who came here seeking new lives. She interviewed everyone who would talk to her, from settlers to soldiers to the Shoshone woman who sometimes came to trade at the general store. She wrote their stories in their own words as much as possible, trying to capture the reality of this place she now called home. Ben helped her however he could. He introduced her to Samuel, the old trapper, who told her stories about the early days of the fur trade that made her pen fly across the pages. He took her to meet a family of homesteaders struggling to make their claim work, and Florence documented their daily lives with careful detail. He even arranged for her to speak with the blacksmith, who had been a slave before the war and had fascinating perspectives on freedom that she had never considered. The book grew slowly but steadily, and Ben was her first reader for every new section. He would sit by their fire in the evening, reading her words with careful attention, occasionally asking questions or suggesting someone else she might interview. His support meant everything to Florence. He believed in her work without question or jealousy. They married on a bright October morning, 6 weeks after Ben had first walked into the general store. The ceremony was simple, performed by the circuit judge who passed through Stillwater monthly. Mrs. Henderson and her husband served as witnesses. Florence wore a new dress of cream-colored cotton, and Ben had trimmed his beard and wore a proper shirt under his buckskin vest. The vows were traditional, but when Ben said, "I do," Florence heard the promise of all the days to come in those two simple words. That night in their new home, Ben was tender and patient with Florence. He had never asked if she was innocent, but he seemed to understand and took his time, making sure she felt safe and cherished. Florence discovered that physical love could be just as beautiful as the words she wrote about it, maybe more so. In Ben's arms, she finally understood what all those love letters had been trying to express. The first months of their marriage were an adjustment. Ben was used to solitude and silence, while Florence was accustomed to the relative bustle of town life. He sometimes grew restless in the house, needing to walk or chop wood to burn off excess energy. She sometimes grew frustrated when he couldn't articulate what he was feeling, even after all her teaching. But they learned to compromise, to communicate beyond words. Florence discovered that Ben expressed love through action more than speech. He would rise early to start the fire so the house was warm when she woke. He brought home game and taught her to cook it properly. He built her a larger desk with better light for her work. When she was discouraged about her book, he would take her to the overlook where he had first told her what life with him would be like, reminding her why she was documenting these stories in the first place. Ben learned to appreciate the power of words through Florence. He started a habit of leaving her notes, simple sentences that grew more eloquent over time. "You make me happy" became, "I thank God for every day I wake up beside you." "I love you" became, "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I will spend my life trying to deserve you." Winter came, hard and cold. The snow piled high around their little house, and customers were few for Florence's letter-writing business. But it gave them time together, long evenings by the fire where Florence worked on her book, and Ben carved pieces of wood into useful household items. He made her a set of bookends, an inkwell holder, a box for storing her papers. His hands, so strong and capable, could create objects of surprising delicacy. One snowy evening in January, Florence set down her pen and rubbed her tired eyes. She had been writing for hours, trying to finish a particularly difficult section about the conflicts between settlers and the native tribes. It was a subject that required careful handling, and she wanted to be fair to all perspectives. "Come sit with me," Ben said from his chair by the fire. "You've been working too hard." Florence joined him, curling up in his lap. He was so large that she fit easily, her head resting against his broad chest. She could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong. "I've been thinking," Ben said, his hand stroking her hair, "about next winter." "What about it?" "I'd like us to spend it in the cabin. My cabin up in the mountains. Would you be willing?" Florence considered. She had known this was coming eventually. Ben had been patient, staying in Stillwater far longer than he usually did, but she could see the longing in his eyes sometimes when he looked toward the mountains. "What about my work?" "You could write your book," Ben said, "without distractions, without people needing letters every day. Just you and your words and all the time in the world. Then in spring, we come back down and you continue with the letters." It was tempting. Florence had to admit that sometimes she resented the constant interruptions, the way she could never fully lose herself in the larger work because someone always needed something small. "Would I go mad from the silence?" Ben chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Maybe. But I'll be there to keep you company. And Samuel too, if you get really desperate. He does love to talk once you get him started." "All right," Florence agreed. "Next winter we'll try the cabin, but if I do go mad, you have to bring me back to civilization." "Deal," Ben said and sealed it with a kiss. Spring came eventually, as it always did. The snow melted, the creeks swelled with runoff, and the plains turned green. Florence's business picked up again, and she found herself busier than ever. Word had spread about her work, and people began coming from neighboring settlements, willing to pay for her skill with words. One morning in May, Florence woke feeling ill. She made it outside just in time to lose the contents of her stomach in the bushes beside the house. Ben was there immediately, holding back her hair and supporting her with one strong arm around her waist. "Are you all right?" he asked, concerned. "Should I fetch the doctor?" Florence straightened slowly, realization dawning. She pressed a hand to her belly, thinking back. "I don't think the doctor is necessary just yet," she said softly. "But we might need him in about 7 months." Ben's eyes went wide. "You're pregnant?" "I think so. I haven't had my monthly courses since March." She looked up at him, suddenly worried. "Are you pleased?" For answer, Ben lifted her clear off her feet, spinning her around with a whoop of joy that probably woke half the town. "Pleased? Florence, I'm thrilled. We're going to have a baby." His enthusiasm was contagious. Florence found herself laughing, her brief fear dissolved by his obvious delight. When he set her down, he immediately began fussing over her, trying to get her back inside, asking if she needed anything, if she should rest. "Ben, I'm pregnant, not dying," she said, amused. Women work through pregnancies all the time. But Ben was having none of it. He insisted on taking over the household chores completely, worried that she would strain herself. He started bringing her tea made from herbs that Mrs. Henderson recommended for morning sickness. He even attempted to turn away customers when he thought Florence looked tired, though she had to scold him for that. "I need to work," she explained patiently. "Both for the money and for my sanity. I promise I'll rest when I need to, but you can't treat me like I'm made of glass." Ben agreed reluctantly, but Florence noticed he stayed close whenever she had customers, as if expecting she might collapse at any moment. It was endearing and exasperating in equal measure. Her pregnancy progressed normally through the summer. Her belly swelled, and she felt the first flutters of movement in July. The first time the baby kicked hard enough for Ben to feel it, he had tears in his eyes. He would spend evenings with his hand on her stomach, talking to the child, telling it stories about the mountains and promising to teach it everything he knew. Florence continued working on her book, driven by a new urgency to finish it before the baby came. She wanted to prove she could do this, could create something meaningful beyond the letters she wrote for others. The manuscript grew to over 200 pages, filled with interviews and observations, her own commentary woven throughout. She wasn't sure if it was any good, but it was honest, and that mattered to her. In September, when Florence was 7 months along, a letter arrived that changed everything. It was addressed to her, sent from a publishing house in New York. Florence stared at it in confusion. She hadn't sent her manuscript to anyone yet, still revising and polishing. She opened it with shaking hands and read. Then read again. Then let out a scream that brought Ben running from the barn where he had been repairing tack. "What's wrong? Is it the baby?" He was at her side immediately, hands on her shoulders. "Nothing's wrong," Florence gasped. "Everything's right. Ben, they want to publish my book." "What? But how did they even know about it?" Florence scanned the letter again. "Mrs. Henderson." She mentioned my project to her sister in Philadelphia, who mentioned it to someone else, and somehow word reached this publisher. They specialize in books about the West. They're asking if I would send them the manuscript for review, and they're so interested they've already offered an advance payment if they decide to accept it. Ben swept her into his arms, careful of her belly. "That's wonderful. I'm so proud of you." Florence felt tears on her cheeks, overwhelmed by emotion. For years, she had dreamed of this moment, of someone beyond her small circle recognizing her words as valuable. And now it was happening, just when she had never been happier with the simple life she had built with Ben. She spent the next 3 weeks frantically finishing the manuscript, writing and rewriting sections, checking facts, polishing every sentence until it gleamed. Ben helped however he could, listening to her read passages aloud, catching inconsistencies in her timeline, offering his own perspectives on events he had witnessed. They sent the manuscript east in early October, carefully packaged to protect it during the long journey. Then there was nothing to do but wait. Florence's baby was due in December, and as November arrived, she found herself increasingly uncomfortable. Her back ached constantly. She couldn't find a comfortable position for sleeping. Her ankles swelled and she had to waddle rather than walk. Ben was unfailingly patient and supportive, massaging her feet and back, helping her up and down, never complaining when she woke him multiple times each night needing to use the privy. On a cold night in early December, Florence's water broke. Ben immediately went into action, fetching Mrs. Henderson, who had agreed to serve as midwife, and boiling water and gathering clean cloths. Florence was frightened, despite having written letters for dozens of women describing their own labors. The reality was so much more intense than words could capture. The labor was long and difficult. Florence labored through the night and into the next day, exhausted and in pain. Ben stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement even when she cursed at him and told him this was all his fault. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, their son was born. He came into the world screaming, healthy and strong. Mrs. Henderson cleaned him up and placed him in Florence's arms, and Florence felt a love so fierce and immediate it took her breath away. "He's perfect," she whispered, studying the tiny face, the shock of dark hair, the little fists waving in the air. Ben leaned over them both, his face full of wonder. "He's so small," he said in awe. "I've never seen anything so small." "What should we name him?" Florence asked. They had discussed names but never settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Ben said, "James, after your father." Florence felt fresh tears. "James Thomas Thorne," she said, testing it out. "I like it." Little James was a good baby, nursing well and sleeping in reasonable stretches. Ben was an attentive father, happy to walk the floor with him when he fussed, to change soiled cloths, to simply hold him and stare in wonder. Florence had worried that the demands of an infant might overwhelm Ben, so used to silence and solitude, but instead he seemed to thrive on it. "He's part of us," Ben explained one night when Florence commented on his patience. "Part of you and me together. How could I not love everything about him?" Christmas came, their second together. Florence was still recovering from the birth, but she felt happy in a way she had never imagined possible. She had a husband who loved her, a beautiful son, work that fulfilled her, and a book that might actually be published. It seemed almost too good to be true. In January, an envelope arrived from New York. Florence stared at it for several minutes before she could make herself open it. Ben took James from her arms and waited silently, giving her space to process whatever news it contained. With shaking hands, Florence broke the seal and read. Then she looked up at Ben with wide eyes. "They're publishing it," she breathed. "They're actually publishing my book, and they want to pay me $300 for it." $300 was more money than Florence had made in her entire career as a scribe. It was enough to build a bigger house, to buy good breeding stock, to ensure their family's security for years. But more than the money, it was validation. Her words, her work, was valuable enough that people would pay money to rate it. Ben set James in his cradle and pulled Florence into his arms. "I always knew you could do it," he said. "You have so much talent, so much to say. The world deserves to hear your words." That night, after they had celebrated with a special dinner and put James to bed, Florence and Ben lay together in their bed, talking about the future. "We need to revise our plans," Ben said. "With the baby, I don't think spending next winter in the cabin makes sense. Maybe when he's older." Florence had been thinking the same thing. "I'm not sure I'm ready to be that isolated with an infant anyway. Maybe we could visit the cabin for shorter trips. I'd still like to see it, to understand that part of your life." "We'll go in the summer," Ben promised. "When James is a bit bigger and the weather is good, you'll love it up there. The meadows are full of wildflowers, and the streams are so clear and cold they take your breath away." "Tell me about it," Florence said, snuggling against his side. "Describe it for me." So Ben talked, his deep voice washing over her, painting pictures with words he had learned from her. He described his cabin in detail, the way the morning light came through the east windows, the view of the mountains from his doorstep. He talked about the silence that was somehow full of sound, wind in the trees and birdsong and the distant howl of wolves. He described the satisfaction of living off the land, of providing for himself through skill and knowledge. Florence listened, already composing the scene in her mind, thinking about how she would write it. Because that's what she did now. She wrote their life, documenting the love story she and Ben were creating day by day. Spring brought new growth and new opportunities. Florence's book was scheduled for publication in the fall, and the publisher wrote asking if she would consider a second book, perhaps focusing on the lives of women in the West. Florence was thrilled and immediately began conducting new interviews, this time specifically with the women of Stillwater and the surrounding settlements. She talked to the wives of ranchers and farmers, to the women who ran boarding houses and laundries, to the widow who had taken over her husband's freight business and was running it more profitably than he ever had. She interviewed Mrs. Henderson about coming west as a young bride, about burying 2 children before they reached their first birthdays, about the strength it took to keep going. She even managed to interview the Shoshone woman whose name was Running Deer, about the changes she had seen in her lifetime and what it meant to watch her world transform around her. Ben supported her completely, watching James during her interview trips, encouraging her when the work felt overwhelming. He had become a fixture around Stillwater, known for his willingness to help neighbors with difficult tasks. When the schoolhouse needed repairs, Ben organized a work party and did most of the heavy lifting himself. When old Samuel broke his leg, Ben checked on him daily, bringing supplies and staying to visit. The town had accepted him, this mountain man who had come down from the high country for love. In June, when James was 6 months old and the weather was perfect, Ben announced it was time to visit the cabin. They loaded supplies onto pack horses, with James riding in a specially designed carrier on Florence's back. The journey took 2 days, climbing steadily into the mountains, following trails that seemed invisible to Florence's untrained eyes but were clearly familiar to Ben. The cabin, when they reached it, was everything Ben had described and more. It sat in a small clearing beside a stream, with mountains rising all around. The logs were weathered but solid, and the roof looked tight. Inside, it was simple but comfortable, with furniture Ben had made himself and a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall. "This is beautiful," Florence said, turning slowly to take it all in. "I can see why you loved it here." "Loved," Ben repeated, catching the past tense. "I still love it, but it's different now. Before, this was enough. Now it's just a place. Home is wherever you and James are." They spent a week at the cabin, and Florence found she did love it. The silence was profound but not oppressive. The air was so clean it almost hurt to breathe. Ben taught her to fish properly, showed her how to identify edible plants, took her on long walks through the meadows he had described. James seemed to thrive in the mountain air, sleeping well and smiling more than usual. One evening, they sat outside watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of orange and purple. James was drowsing in Florence's arms, milk-drunk and content. Ben sat beside her on the bench he had built years ago, his arm around her shoulders. "Thank you," Florence said quietly. "For what?" "For sharing this with me. For understanding that I needed to see it, to experience this part of your life. For being willing to leave it behind when you had to." Ben pressed a kiss to her temple. "I told you before, I'd miss the mountains, but I'd miss you more. That's still true. This place is in my blood, but you're in my heart, and the heart matters more." Florence turned to kiss him properly, careful not to jostle the sleeping baby. "I love you, Ben Thorne, more than I have words to express, which is saying something for a writer." "I love you too," Ben said, "and I finally have the words to tell you so, thanks to you." They returned to Stillwater at the end of the week, both feeling refreshed and reconnected. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm through the summer and into fall. Florence worked on her second book while managing her letter-writing business. Ben took on whatever work was available, from building to hauling to guiding hunting parties. James grew, reaching all his milestones right on schedule, bringing joy to everyone who met him. In September, a package arrived containing the first copies of Florence's book. She held it reverently, hardly believing that this real, physical object contained her words. The cover was simple but elegant, with her name printed in bold letters. "The Frontier Spirit, Voices from the American West" by Florence Thorne. Thorne, her married name. She was no longer Florence Sutherland, the lonely scribe. She was Florence Thorne, wife and mother and published author. The transformation still took her breath away sometimes. The book sold better than anyone expected. The publisher ordered a second printing within 3 months. Florence began receiving letters from readers, mostly other women, thanking her for documenting these stories, for giving voice to experiences that were often overlooked. Several universities wrote requesting permission to use excerpts in their courses. It was more success than Florence had dared to hope for. With the money from the book sales, they built a larger house, one with a separate room for Florence's writing and proper bedrooms for their growing family. Because Florence was pregnant again, due in the spring. This time, the morning sickness was worse, but she was less frightened, knowing what to expect. Ben was just as excited about the second baby as he had been about the first. He had already started enlarging James's cradle to accommodate the new arrival. He talked about teaching them both to ride, to track, to appreciate the wilderness. Florence listened and smiled, loving him for his dreams even as she insisted their children would also learn to read and write fluently. "Of course," Ben agreed. "They'll have the best of both of us. Your words and my woods." Their daughter was born in April, during a spring storm that rattled the windows and made the house feel cozy and protected. The labor was shorter than with James, and their little girl arrived just after dawn, squalling her displeasure at the cold world. They named her Rose, after the wild roses that grew along the creek in summer. James, now 15 months old, was fascinated by his baby sister. He would stand by her cradle, reaching out with gentle fingers to touch her hair, babbling to her in his own language. Ben watched over both of them with equal devotion, somehow managing to make each child feel like his favorite. Florence's second book was published that fall, to even better reviews than the first. The publisher was already asking about a third book, but Florence was hesitant. With 2 young children, she had less time for extensive research and interviews. She continued with her letter writing, but even that had to be balanced against the demands of motherhood. "Maybe you should take a break," Ben suggested one evening. He was holding Rose while James played at his feet, building towers from wooden blocks Ben had carved. "The books will still be there when the children are older." Florence knew he was right, but part of her feared that if she stopped, she would never start again. That she would lose herself in domesticity and forget she had once been a woman with ambitions beyond her family. Ben seemed to sense her thoughts. "You'll always be a writer," he said gently. "That's not something you can turn off, but maybe right now you could write smaller things. Stories for the children, letters for yourself, our story, like I asked you to do from the beginning." Florence realized he was right. She had been so focused on writing for publication for an audience that she had neglected the writing that had brought them together in the first place. That night, after the children were in bed, she pulled out the journal she had started when Ben first courted her. She had stopped writing in it after their marriage, caught up in the business of living. Now she opened it to a fresh page and began to write. She wrote about their life together, about the joy and challenges of building something real and lasting. She wrote about watching Ben become a father, about how his strength and gentleness with their children made her fall in love with him all over again. She wrote about her fears and hopes, her dreams for their future. And she wrote about love, about how it wasn't always the grand romantic gestures from novels, but rather the quiet, steady devotion of everyday life. Writing for herself, without the pressure of publication, was freeing. Florence found her voice again, the one that had been buried under practical concerns and professional ambitions. She wrote when she could, in stolen moments between childcare and housework, capturing their life in words that no one else might ever read. But Ben asked to read them, as he had in the beginning. So she read aloud to him in the evenings, sharing her observations and feelings. And Ben, who had once claimed to have no words, would offer his own thoughts, surprising her with his growing eloquence. The mountain man who could barely string a sentence together when they met now spoke in full paragraphs, expressing himself with a clarity that matched his actions. "You taught me that," he said when she commented on it. "You showed me that words aren't just sounds, they're ways of sharing what's inside you, ways of connecting with people you love." Years passed, full and rich. James grew into a sturdy boy who loved the outdoors as much as his father. Rose proved to have her mother's way with words, telling elaborate stories before she could even write them down. A third child arrived, Another son they named Henry, who seemed to combine the best traits of both his siblings. Florence continued writing, balancing her work with family life. She published a third book, this one a collection of essays about women's experiences in the West. She maintained her letter-writing business, though on a smaller scale, and she kept her journal, documenting their love story as it unfolded day by day, year by year. Ben trapped in the fall and winter, but only for a few weeks at a time. He could never stay away from his family for long. The rest of the year, he worked in and around Stillwater, becoming one of the town's most respected citizens. He served on the school board, helped organize community projects, and was always the first person neighbors called when they needed assistance with difficult or dangerous tasks. On their 10th anniversary, Ben took Florence back to the Overlook where he had first told her what life with him would be like. The children were with Mrs. Henderson for the day, giving them rare time alone together. They stood in the same spot, looking out over the plains to the mountains beyond, and Florence marveled at how much had changed and how much remained the same. "You remember what I told you here?" Ben asked. "You said it wouldn't be easy," Florence recalled. "That it would be hard work and long silences and months of cold, but also freedom and beauty and being part of something bigger than ourselves." Was I right? Florence considered. Their life together had indeed been hard work at times. The winters were brutal, money was often tight, and raising children was exhausting. But it had also been everything else Ben promised and more. She had found freedom in this wild place, beauty in the everyday moments, and a sense of belonging she had never known in Boston. "You were right," she said, "about all of it, and I wouldn't change a single thing." Ben pulled her close and she melted into his embrace. Even after 10 years and 3 children, his touch still made her pulse race. "I love you," he said. "More now than on that day I walked into the general store and asked you to write our love story." "I love you too," Florence said. "And we've written quite a story, haven't we?" "We have, but it's not finished yet. We've got a lot more chapters ahead of us." He was right. They were only in their 30s, with potentially decades stretching before them. Florence thought about all the things still to come, watching their children grow up and start families of their own, growing old together, continuing to build their life in this place they loved. That evening, back home with their children, Florence sat at her desk and opened her journal. She wrote about the anniversary, about standing at the Overlook again, about the solid certainty of her love for Ben. Then she paused, pen hovering over the page, and made a decision. She flipped back to the beginning of the journal, to those first entries about a mountain man who had asked her to write their love story. She read through years of entries, reliving their courtship and marriage, the births of their children, the challenges they had overcome. It was all there, documented in her careful script. Their love story, exactly as Ben had requested. Florence looked up to find Ben watching her from his chair by the fire. Henry was asleep in his lap. Rose was curled up beside him with a book, and James was building something with his blocks in the corner. It was such an ordinary scene, so domestic and peaceful, but Florence saw the extraordinary in it. This was what they had built together, this family, this life, this love. "What are you thinking about?" Ben asked quietly, careful not to wake Henry. Florence smiled. "I'm thinking that I need to write the ending to our story." "It's not over yet," Ben pointed out as he had on the Overlook. "I know, but I need to write an ending anyway, for the book." Ben's eyebrows rose. "What book?" "The book I'm going to make from this journal. Our love story from beginning to wherever we are now. Not for publication necessarily, just for us and for our children someday. So they'll know how we started, how much we loved each other, how much we loved them." "I think that's a fine idea," Ben said. "But what will your ending be?" Florence thought about it. How did you end a love story that was still unfolding? What words could possibly capture the ongoing nature of their commitment? The way their love deepened and changed, but never diminished. She began to write, and the words came easily, as they always did when she was writing truth. This is not an ending but a pause, a moment to look back at the road traveled before turning toward the horizon ahead. We have built something remarkable from that first unexpected meeting, a partnership, a family, a love that weathers all seasons. Ben once asked me to write our love story. I thought then that I was skilled with words, that I understood love from all the letters I had written for others. But I knew nothing. Love is not the carefully crafted phrases in a love letter or the dramatic declarations in novels. It is simpler and more complex than words can fully capture. It is the choice to stay, day after day, even when it is difficult. It is the gentle touch in the night, the shared glance across a room, the thousand small kindnesses that build a life together. It is watching your partner hold your sleeping child and feeling your heart might burst from the fullness of it. It is growing together, learning from each other, becoming more than you were alone. Our story is not finished. There will be more joy and more sorrow, more challenges and more triumphs. We will watch our children grow and eventually leave. We will grow old together if we are blessed. And through it all, I know this. I will love Ben Thorne until my last breath and beyond if such things are possible. He walked into my life when I least expected it and asked me to write our love story. I said yes, and it has been the best decision of my life. So this is not an ending. This is merely an acknowledgement that love stories do not end as long as there is love. And we, Ben and I, will love each other always. Florence set down her pen and wiped away tears. Ben had put Henry in his bed and was crossing the room to her. He read over her shoulder, his solid presence warm against her back. "That's beautiful," he said quietly. "That's exactly right." Florence turned in her chair and wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face against his chest. She heard his heartbeat, steady and strong, the same rhythm that had comforted her for 10 years. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For asking me to write our love story, for giving me a story worth writing." Ben lifted her chin and kissed her gently. "Thank you for saying yes. For taking a chance on a rough mountain man who didn't have pretty words. For teaching me how to express what was in my heart. For giving me this life, these children, this love." They stood there together for a long moment, holding each other while their children played and slept around them. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of the mountains. This was their love story, not perfect, not without struggle, but real and true and lasting. Florence had written countless letters for other people, capturing their joys and sorrows, their declarations and confessions. But this story, hers and Ben's, was the one that mattered most. This was the story she would tell and retell through all their years together, through words and actions, through the life they built day by day. And it was, she thought, the best story she had ever written. The years continued to unfold with the kind of steady happiness that Florence had once thought only existed in novels. James, Rose, and Henry grew into fine young people, each carrying pieces of both their parents. James had his father's love of the wilderness and his mother's way with words. Rose was curious and bold, equally comfortable with a rifle or a pen. Henry proved to be the gentlest of them all, with a gift for healing that led him to apprentice with the town doctor. Florence's books became standard texts in schools back east, used to teach students about life on the frontier. She published 2 more over the years, but her greatest work remained the private journal documenting her life with Ben. She added to it regularly, capturing the moments that made up their days. Ben teaching James to track deer, Rose reading to her younger brother, Henry bandaging a neighbor's injury. The whole family gathered around the dinner table sharing stories of their day. Ben grew into middle age gracefully, his strength undiminished even as silver began threading through his dark hair. He was still the most capable man in Stillwater, still the first person people called in a crisis. But he was softer now, gentled by love and fatherhood, his rough edges worn smooth by years of family life. They took the children to the mountain cabin every summer, and eventually James built his own cabin nearby. He had inherited his father's need for wilderness, and he courted a young woman from Stillwater with the same determination Ben had shown with Florence. When James brought his bride-to-be to meet his parents, Florence saw herself at 23 in the young woman's nervous excitement. Rose surprised everyone by deciding to become a teacher, using her mother's books to educate her students about their own history. She married a rancher and proved just as capable running cattle as she was running a classroom. Henry went east to medical school, but he promised to return and bring modern medicine back to the territory. Through it all, Ben and Florence remained the center of their family's universe. Their love, which had started as a wild leap of faith, had matured into something unshakable. They knew each other's thoughts with a glance, could communicate whole conversations without words. They had weathered illnesses and injuries, financial hardships and the deaths of friends. They had celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, births and weddings, all the milestones of a life fully lived. On a warm summer evening, 25 years after they first met, Ben found Florence sitting at her desk, her journal open before her. Her hair was more gray than auburn now, and fine lines had etched themselves around her eyes and mouth. But to Ben, she was still the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. "What are you writing?" he asked, leaning over to kiss the top of her head. "The ending to our story," Florence said. "The real one this time." Ben pulled up a chair. "I thought you said our story doesn't end." "It doesn't, not really. But I realized I never finished that book I started years ago, the one just for us and the children. I need to bring it to a close, even if our life together continues." "What does it say?" Florence turned the journal so he could read it. Ben's reading had improved dramatically over the years, and he read her words with the careful attention he gave everything she wrote. 25 years ago, a mountain man walked into a general store and asked a lonely scribe to write their love story. She agreed, having no idea what she was truly agreeing to. She thought she was simply helping someone find the words to court her. Instead, she found everything she had been searching for without knowing she was searching. Ben Thorne gave me more than love, though the love alone would have been enough. He gave me adventure and partnership, a family and a home. He gave me a life worth documenting, stories worth telling, moments worth preserving. He taught me that words, while powerful, are not everything. That sometimes the most important things are expressed through actions, through quiet devotion, through simply showing up day after day. I have written many books in my life, but this one, our private story, is my masterpiece. Not because the writing is particularly elegant or profound, but because it documents something real and rare. A love that lasted, that grew, that transformed two lonely people into something greater than they were alone. If our children or grandchildren ever read this, I want them to know, true love exists. It does not look like the romances in novels, with grand gestures and dramatic declarations. It looks like your father bringing me coffee every morning for 25 years. It looks like me reading to him every evening, sharing the words I love. It looks like building a life together, piece by piece, day by day, with patience and kindness and unwavering commitment. This is our love story. It began with a question and a journal and a mountain man who wanted to learn to express his heart. It continues in our children, in the life we built, in every moment we choose each other again. And when we are gone, it will live on in the legacy we leave behind. Thank you, Ben Thorne, for asking me to write our story. It has been the privilege of my life. Ben finished reading with tears in his eyes. After all these years, Florence could still surprise him with her ability to capture feelings he barely knew he had. He took her ink-stained hand in his work-roughened one, bringing it to his lips. "Thank you," he said simply, "for writing it, for living it, for loving me." Florence stood and wrapped her arms around him, and they held each other in the quiet room as the sun set outside their window. They had come so far from that first meeting, that nervous courtship, those early days of learning each other. But the essence of who they were together had never changed. They were still two people who had chosen each other, who continued to choose each other, who would always choose each other. That night, after they had extinguished the lamps and climbed into the bed they had shared for so many years, Ben pulled Florence close and whispered, "Tell me our story, from the beginning." Florence smiled in the darkness. He asked her this sometimes, wanting to hear their history in her words. So she told it, as she had told it many times before, but somehow it was always new. She told him about the first time she saw him, how imposing he had seemed. She told him about the overlook, about falling in love, about their wedding day. She recounted the births of their children, the building of their home, the successes and failures that had marked their years together. Ben listened, as he always did, occasionally adding his own memories, his own perspective on events they had shared. And when she finished, he told her his version, the story of a lonely mountain man who had found salvation in a scribe's smile, who had learned that love was worth any sacrifice, who had discovered that home was not a place but a person. Their voices mingled in the darkness, weaving their individual stories into the shared narrative that was their life together. And Florence thought, not for the first time, that this was what love truly was. Two stories becoming one, two lives intertwining so completely that you could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. They fell asleep in each other's arms as they had done for 25 years, as they would do for all the years remaining to them. The journal lay on Florence's desk, its pages filled with their story, a testament to what they had built together. It was not a fairy tale with a simple, happily ever after. It was something better, a real story about real people who had found real love and nurtured it into something that would outlast them both. The mountain man and the scribe, bound together by words and love, by choice and commitment, by the simple, profound decision to write their story together. And it was, Florence thought as sleep claimed her, the best story ever told.